Narrative perspective. This presentation is about the author's point of view. In this presentation, you will learn how to identify the perspective of the narrator in a story. This presentation is brought to you by eReadingWorksheets.com. Dialogue and narration. To be able to accurately identify the narrator's perspective, you need to understand the difference between dialogue and narration. Dialogue is when characters speak. Narration is when the narrator speaks. Quotation marks separate narration from dialogue, like in the following example. "Help," my cousin Jack said. In this example, there are two voices. First is the voice of my cousin Jack. This is indicated by quotation marks, which show us when characters are speaking. Quotation marks go around dialogue, or the voices of the characters. My cousin Jack said is the voice of the narrator. The narrator is telling us who is speaking. Notice there are no quotation marks around the narrator's voice. Identifying narrative perspective. The narrator's perspective is about the narrator, that is to say, the person who is telling the story. Therefore, we're not concerned with looking at the dialogue or the voices of the characters inside of quotation marks. We're not interested in what characters are saying, at least not for the purpose of identifying the narrator's perspective. Only the narrator's voice matters. Pronoun case. We are trying to figure out the narrator's viewpoint on the story. We are assisted in this by paying attention to the case of the pronouns that the narrator is using. These are signal words that indicate the perspective. First person will watch for I, me, my, mine, we, us, ours. Second person will watch for you and your. And third person will be watching for he, she, her, they, and them, also characters' names. If we notice the narrator frequently using these words, it may help us identify the perspective of the narrator. Here is a secret. I am in the room. I am the first person. Then you come in the room. Which person are you in the room? You are the second person. Then he or she came into the room. He or she would then be which person? That is right, he or she would be the third person. This is a secret to help you identify which pronoun indicates which case. First person. In first-person perspective, the narrator is part of the story, usually an active character. Often, the narrator will be using I or we, because the narrator is telling his or her own story, firsthand. So I will frequently be used. For example, I went home. Tim came over. I couldn't play. Notice that the narrator is telling his own story, I's story. This makes it first person. Second person. Second-person narration is usually used for instructions. It uses you from your perspective. For example, first gather your materials. Add 1 cup of sugar to flour. So instructions or recipes are frequently written from second-person perspective. That is to say, you are the agent in the sentences. Third person. In third person, the narrator usually isn't involved in the story. He or she is telling other people's stories. That is why the narrator will be using lots of he or she's, as well as characters' names. There are 3 types of third-person narration. The difference between the 3 types is basically on the question, does the narrator tell the thoughts and feelings of the characters? So the only thing that we're concerned with is identifying whether the narrator is revealing the thoughts and feelings of the characters, as this is what differentiates the 3 types of third-person narration. Third-person omniscient. In third-person omniscient narration, the narrator is all-knowing. The narrator will tell the thoughts and feelings of more than one character. We can remember this because omni means all, and sint means knowing. Put together, the words are all-knowing. The narrator is all-knowing. For example, Tim was mad at Shay. He blamed her. Shay knew Tim would be mad, but she wanted to live her life. You can see in the bolded portions of the example that the narrator is revealing characters' thoughts or feelings, such as Tim was mad, or Shay knew. Third-person limited. In third-person limited narration, the narrator is limited to the thoughts and feelings of one character. So the narrator will tell us how one character thinks and feels. For example, Tim was mad at Shay. He blamed her. Shay just left without saying anything. She left a note and then left him. In this example, we see that the narrator reveals the thoughts and feelings of one character. Only Tim's thoughts and feelings are revealed. Since the narration is limited exclusively to one character, in this case Tim, this passage is narrated from third-person limited perspective. Third-person objective. Third-person objective narration, the narrator does not reveal any character's thoughts or feelings. This does not mean that we can not understand how characters are thinking or feeling, only that the narrator doesn't reveal explicitly or doesn't clearly state what the characters are thinking and feeling. Readers can still understand what characters are thinking and feeling through their dialogue and their actions, as the narrator will continue to reveal the characters' dialogues and actions. For example, Tim slammed the door. He walked upstairs and read a note from Shay. He kicked her trash can and started crying. In this example, the narrator doesn't tell us what Tim is thinking or feeling, but because of his actions, we can infer that Tim is upset at Shay. Here's some tips on identifying narrator's perspective. Check for first or second person perspective before worrying about objective, limited, or omniscient. This will save you time. Ask yourself, whose story is the narrator telling? Is he telling his own story, which would make it first person, my story, which would make it second person, or someone else's story, which would make it third person? Remember to focus on the narration, not the dialogue. I hope this helps you accurately identify the narrator's perspective. You can test your abilities at ereadingworksheets.com. Go to ereadingworksheets.com for free online practice assessments in narrator's perspective and more.